Welcome everyone to the Fermentation Association's webinar of Intro to HACCP. I'm Amelia Nielsen-Stoll, editor of TFA. We are a trade group that was launched to support producers who use fermentation to create delicious and often healthful food and beverages. Our goals are to help educate consumers about fermentation and its benefits, support scientific research into those benefits, and work with food safety authorities to establish clearer and more appropriate regulations in regards to fermentation. Today, we bring you three great speakers: Charlie Kalish, food safety consultant and trainer; David Ehreth of Sonoma Brinery; and Dr. Fred Breidt, microbiologist at the Agriculture Research Service Division of the USDA. We have many questions already submitted and reviewed with our speakers. If there are additional topics you'd like to see addressed, please enter them in the chat below and we will try to get to them. All right, I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Amelia. My name is David Ehreth, and I am the president and founder of Sonoma Brinery. I am co-hosting today with Dr. Fred Breidt, and I should say it's my honor to co-host with Dr. Fred Breidt, who is quite a luminary in our business. And our speaker today, Charlie Kalish. And if I could just give you a little background on how I know Charlie. And Charlie, I promise I won't say everything.
Thank you.
I
have an NDA. Remember.
I've actually known Charlie and his brother Michael and his mother Barbara for some years, and I've watched these boys sort of grow up in the industry and take on some really fascinating work. In fact, when my company, Sonoma Brinery, began to look at HACCP, which really began back when the Food Safety and Food Modernization Safety Act was being contemplated, I honestly didn't understand or know what HACCP was, Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point. And so I immediately, seeing that there was legislation coming our way, did some research, found out that it seemed at the time to be an immensely complicated, just maze of regulation, requirements, and so on and so forth. And so I turned to Charlie and his brother Michael for help on this, who they were had formed a consulting group to help folks like me, producers unfamiliar with this territory, learn how to manufacture with a much higher degree of safety. And what I found was that HACCP is actually a very well thought out, very nicely layered architecture. And Charlie's going to talk to you about that and hopefully make it clear to those of you who are confused by the scope of the regulation and everything from, washing your tools to understanding the microbiology sufficiently to do things that will impair or attenuate the possibility of pathogens. So today, I am representing more or less the vendor community and those of us who are burdened with actually implementing and practicing HACCP. Dr. Breidt is here to augment the discussion with his really superior knowledge of microbiology and the why of critical control points and how microbiology can be manipulated by the implementation of well thought out critical control points. And so when we get to the question and answer, Dr. Breidt is here to give us a real depth of knowledge on the microbiological part of it. I can help with the discussion of how a vendor approaches this. And of course, Charlie is the expert on how this all gets done. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Charlie Kalish, and he's got a presentation for us. And Charlie, take it away.
You're muted.
You're muted, Charlie. There you
I'm
go.
muted. That's right. So thank you. So I didn't know, Fred, you wanted to introduce yourself.
Well, just briefly, I'll say I'm here in Raleigh, North Carolina. You can see my cave behind me. They usually keep me locked in there. But it'll be a real pleasure to hear your talk, Charlie, so I won't delay. You're right at that interface between the research, the data, and the hands-on, what's happening out there in the real world. And that's a great place to be. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Then it's appropriate I'm at the interface between you and David. So thank you for that. And really it is an honor to be presenting with some of my heroes here. David's a hero and Fred's a hero. And I really like what the Fermentation Association is doing. The way they time this all is almost like a space launch. So speaking of space launches, I'll be talking about that in my presentation, which I'm going to put up here. Let me share my screen. Okay, and then I'm going to present. Okay, can everybody see that first slide okay? Yeah, good. All right, now I'm going to give this presentation, I was told to give it in around 20 minutes to 30 minutes. Reminds me of the Woody Allen joke, where he said, I took a speed reading course and read War and Peace. It's about, in like 5 hours, it's about Russia, right? So there's a lot of things that we could talk about in this time, but I'm gonna try to consolidate it and communicate in a way it's as simple as possible. And I'm sure the inevitable outcome of this, and actually I think it's a desirable outcome, is that there's gonna be more questions than answers. And that's why this is one important piece in what should be an ongoing conversation about HACCP and how that's gonna, how that can be useful for you. So I'm gonna start with the first part where I'm gonna provide a brief history of HACCP and the Food Safety Modernization Act, how that came into place. Part two is gonna be a little analogy where we're gonna explore some basic fundamental HACCP terminology. And then part three is gonna be a short sort of what's next, where I'm gonna talk about, I'm gonna bring up some good questions for you to help drive your HACCP development as you go out and make your own HACCP plans. All right, HACCP is relatively new for us, but it's been around since the 60s with the space program. Since then, it's been adopted by FDA and USDA for regulating a number of different food products. For example, there's seafood HACCP, there's USDA HACCP for meat and poultry, there's juice HACCP under FDA, and HACCP has also been adopted for in the FDA food code, which has been, which is recommended for counties and other jurisdictions all around the country that regulate the food service retail space. But I'm going to start, I think that a good introduction to HACCP is with the space program, because it gives you an idea of what it's all about. So in the 60s, NASA, as you all probably know, was trying to send human beings up into space. And when humans are in space, they need food, just like they need oxygen and water. And so NASA, being, a whole bunch of engineers, they looked at what could go wrong, and then how do we prevent those things from going wrong before they happen. Because when you send up a space launch, if the rocket explodes, you can't bring it back down and fix it and resend it, right? I mean, you got to prevent it before it happens. So they needed a high degree of assurance that the food was going to be safe. And what they found out was that the traditional model for making food did not have the controls, the preventive controls that they needed to make sure that the food was safe. So they had this, dystopic nightmare vision of astronauts in zero gravity pooping and vomiting, and it could ruin the mission, right? So they teamed up with Pillsbury to come up with what we now know as HACCP. So here's an idea of what the old model looked like. I have a flow diagram here on the right. You can see every step from receiving through shipping. And there were not many controls in place, not much record keeping until you got to the shipping point, at which point they would take maybe a sample and send it off to be tested. And if it came back negative for whatever it was, E. coli, what have you, they said, oh, well, it must be safe. And then if people got sick, what do? They just recall all that food. This is not a very efficient system, and it's not very preventive in nature. So what NASA and Pillsbury did was they came up with an alternative which they called HACCP, or Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. That is not necessarily self-explaining, right? Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. What does that really mean? Generally speaking, it's where you have that same process flow, except there might be some steps in that process where you exert some kind of control to make sure that the food is going to be safe. Okay, so for example, if you're going to be pasteurizing milk, your pasteurization step might be a CCP. We'll talk more about what determines a CCP in a bit. So HACCP, in summary, though, it's a systematic approach where we consider all of our ingredients. We consider every process step from when we receive our raw materials or ingredients all the way through to shipping out our final product. It considers all reasonable and foreseeable hazards. So you don't need to consider things that are extremely remote, like a comet hitting your plant. Don't need to consider that. But things that where there's a history or where there's a reasonable probability that it can happen. Like, for example, E. coli in a lightly fermented food. HACCP shifted the focus away from recalling food and trying to do damage control with outbreaks to preventing those things from happening in the first place. And in order to make that happen, HACCP could not be a standalone solution. There's just no way that would work. You could have $1 million HACCP plan that NASA builds for you at Pillsbury, it wouldn't matter if you didn't do the basic good manufacturing practices that you need to make sure that you have safe conditions for making food, like washing your hands, cleaning things effectively, having surfaces that are cleanable. So having a strong foundation of GMPs and making sure that you have a good culture that reinforces the importance of food safety, and having a good training program to make sure people know what they're supposed to be doing. All those things are critical and foundational to having a good HACCP system. So here, I've actually sort of pulled this out of the FDA food code. So the FDA food code is something that FDA develops as a model for all the different jurisdictions all the different regulators that regulate retail and food service to adopt and put in place wherever they are. So here in California, for example, we have the California Retail Food Code, and they adopt some version of the FDA food code, because the FDA food code is just recommendations. And in the FDA food code, it says that if you're engaging in any of these activities, that you're expected to have a HACCP plan. And I put here in black, curing food, and using food additives or adding vinegar. Food additives is code here for, it could be salt, right? Like, let's say that you're making sauerkraut or pickles or something like that. And then, of course, they leave the door open for requiring a HACCP plan with that last bullet on the right, preparing food by another method that's determined to require one. So you might say, oh, I'm making koji, and they'll say, koji, what? They may say you can't do it, or they might, say, hey, we reserve the right to require you to have a HACCP plan because I don't know how that works. In 2011, we had the Food Safety Modernization Act, which David mentioned. And this was a radical change to the inspection paradigm that FDA had, where I'm just gonna give you a very simple graphic to explain it. They moved away from just inspecting you, looking at your good manufacturing practices, to your good manufacturing practices plus what they call a food safety plan. It's almost identical to a HACCP plan. Why they called it a food safety plan instead of a HACCP plan, I'm sure there's a lot of interesting explanations. Would have been easier for everybody if they just said HACCP plan, but they require one of those. Plus, there's a record requirement where you keep records for at least 2 years. That may change depending on the nature of the record. For example, a training record or a record on an important piece of equipment, you might need to keep as long as you have that employee or as long as you have that equipment plus 2 years. But the magic number, the general magic number is 2 years. So this was a huge shift. And now all food manufacturers and processors who at one time just had to do the GMPs, those are the minimum, the regulatory minimum, now have to have what is basically a HACCP plan. So it's much more important for a lot of people. I mentioned earlier prerequisite programs with good manufacturing practices. Prerequisite programs, I won't spend too much time on this, but they are, the GMPs are actually regulations. They say you have to have good lighting. They say that you have to have utensils and equipment that are cleanable. They say you have to wash your hands. So all those basic operating and environmental conditions that you need to make safe food are listed in those regulations. USDA has it, FDA has it. Prerequisite programs is just a fancy way for saying, these are all the ways that I'm going to address those GMP requirements. So I'm gonna have a written standard operating procedure for how we wash our hands and how we clean equipment. And we're gonna have policies that say, you can't enter our plant unless you're wearing a hairnet. And you can't, if you have, a supplier, you need to approve that supplier. So prerequisite programs is just really a bucket term for how you're gonna address all the basic operating and environmental conditions that you need for making safe food. And that's going to be the bedrock of your HACCP plan. So if we imagine the HACCP plan is the house, the prerequisite programs is the foundation. Okay, I think that's enough. So I'm going to move on. This is just what those GMPs would look like for USDA. And you can see there in the bullets, maintenance of your grounds, pest control, construction, make sure that it's appropriate for what you're doing, ventilation, plumbing. So these are all very basic things that need to be in place before you do HACCP. Here's the one, here are the GMPs for FDA. And you'll see the same kinds of stuff. So if you look in these different sections, they'll look just like the USDA one. Okay, so that's part one. That's the sort of background on HACCP, how it came about, how the Food Safety Modernization Act came about. Now we're going to jump into HACCP fundamentals. Okay, so there are 12 steps of HACCP. The first 5 are referred to as the 5 preliminary HACCP steps. Okay, I'm going to read through these because they're important. The first one is to assemble the HACCP team. Then 2 and 3 typically go together. That's where you're going to describe the food and its distribution. Some specs for the food, for example, does it need to be refrigerated? How is it packaged? 3, the intended use and consumers of the food. So does it need to be cooked or is it ready to eat? That kind of information. 4 is develop a flow diagram where you can visually see your process flow from start to finish. Number 5, very important, verify that flow diagram. So I'm just gonna go into this a little bit. So when you assemble the HACCP team, typically you might make an org chart where you can show the hierarchy, where who reports to who's the decision maker for what. It's going to include typically people who are in more of a supervisory role or a management role who are going to take responsibility for the food safety plan. But it can also include personnel who are directly involved in the day-to-day operations on the production floor. It could be even maintenance personnel. The goal is that your team is going to be cross-functional. So you should have, somebody from production, somebody from quality control, somebody from management, so that you can have many different perspectives going into the decision-making underlying your food safety system. If you are a chef at a restaurant, then your team will be considerably smaller. If you're a one-person show, you won't have an org chart, it'll just be you. So the ideal is that you're gonna have that many voices, that many, lots of expertise on your team, but if you don't have that, that's okay. And you could also include somebody like an extension specialist or a consultant to be on your team, or at least a contact who can be part of your decision-making process and help you out. Typically, we also represent the HACCP team in a team table, where you can also detail what kind of experience these people have, what responsibilities, what roles that they have. The second and third preliminary HACCP tasks typically involve a product description table where you can give a full profile of your different products. Develop a flow diagram, verify it. We're 4 and 5. I stole this flow diagram from Fred's paper, which I'm going to say everybody should read. Even if you're not making kimchi, I think it's just really great to read it. Just to get an idea, a model for how you might approach your fermented product, even though there's a lot of variation in fermented products. I also put here a lucid chart. So if you don't want to make a flow diagram, So Fred's a hero of mine, but this flow diagram is, and it serves its purpose. It's elegant in simplicity. But if you want an easy way to make flow diagrams, I really recommend checking out Lucidchart. It's just easy drag and drop. I think it costs like $6 or $8 a month. They don't pay me or anything like that. I just think it's really useful. All right, so those were the first 5 steps of HACCP. Now we get into the next 7, which are commonly referred to as the 7 principles of HACCP. And I'm seeing comments and stuff pulling, or something pulling up. Oh, it's in the chat. Just want to make sure there's nothing. Ah, okay. So other people are doing it. So I'm seeing questions come up. We can maybe get back to that during the Q&A. And they're all very good questions. Okay. So I also put up a little screenshot of Fred's paper here. So if you want to search that, you can easily search it on Google, and maybe it's available through the Fermentation Association too. Anyways, contact them to figure out how you can get your copy. But I really recommend, once we, after we go through this presentation and you log off, I recommend checking out what we talked about, or thinking about what we talked about, and reading that paper and start going between them, because it will help. So I'm going to give you the 7 principles of HACCP here. It's kind of, it's loaded with technical terms. If you've never heard of critical limits before, this isn't going to mean all that much. So I'm going to walk through an analogy that helps unpack all this. Let's see. All right, so to revisit HACCP, it's a systematic approach to identifying, evaluating, and controlling food safety hazards. Now, consider this situation, which doesn't involve making food. I go to the doctor, and the doctor says, Charlie, you're not in good health. Like, you need to make a change in your life. And she cites a study that says if you eat more fruit and vegetables, then you will be healthier. I say, okay, great. What do I need to do? And she says, well, because this is so important, and because I don't trust you just do it on your own, because you might do it for a week and then stop, what I want you to do is make a record of every meal. I want you to write down how many servings of fruit you eat and how many fruit servings of vegetables you eat with every meal, okay? And what this will do is it'll create a record that your wife can then sign off on and say, yes, he ate that, okay? And that's a very important thing, because if she's not verifying it, then I may stop doing it, right? So she's going to be an important support person in this process. Occasionally, maybe every few months, I'm going to go in and get blood tests, and they're going to tell me if my health is improving or not. And at the end of the year, I go back to the doctor after doing all this, and the doctor says, guess what, Charlie, you're back in good shape. Congratulations. All right. So we can think about this situation in terms of HACCP, because HACCP is not, it is a systematic way of, making safe food, but HACCP, the concept, can be applied to virtually anything in your life. Hazard, I've adjusted it here a little bit, but something that is reasonably likely to cause illness or injury in the absence of its control. Remember that. And hazard analysis is the process of collecting and evaluating information on hazards to decide which are significant and need to be addressed by a HACCP plan. Finally, this is the last definition I'm showing you here. A critical control point is a step where you can apply control, and it's totally essential to make sure that you eliminate a food safety hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level. So hazard analysis can really be broken up into 3 steps. You identify the hazards or collect the hazards, figure out what they are, evaluate those hazards for how serious they are, how likely they are to occur, and then from that risk assessment, you determine what the critical control points are going to be for the CCPs. So if we consider this scenario, what are the hazards? Is it that I'm not eating healthy? Is it that I'm not exercising enough? Is it that I have some kind of genetic predisposition? Recall that the hazard is something, i.e. that is the agent that is actually going to make me sick. So in this particular situation, I'm going to move on. In this particular situation, the hazard is going to be that I'm not getting the nutrition I need. It's the absence of the nutrition that is making me sick. I'm not getting what I need, right? So sure, I might actually be eating unhealthy. I might be going to McDonald's and eating cheeseburgers all the time, but that is not necessarily what's making me sick. The actual agent that's making me sick is the absence of these critical nutrients that I need, right? Exercise, genetic predisposition, those could certainly weigh in and be hazards, but we haven't really brought that up. So recall that a hazard analysis is the process of collecting and evaluating information on hazards to decide which are significant and which are not. Now, when you go to a doctor, what's the first thing you do? You don't see the doctor, you go in the waiting room. They give you a form that you have to fill out, and you have to fill out this questionnaire. You say, do you smoke? What's your family history? So what they're doing is they're actually trying to collect information, things that might explain why you might be sick. They're going to ask you questions. The nurse will bring you into the room and say, you know, do you smoke? They'll ask you a lot of the same questions, maybe some different questions. The doctor will come in and feel on your neck and take your blood, maybe take your blood pressure, and the nurse will do that. So basically what they're doing is they are gathering information and evaluating that information in order to make a diagnosis, to say, based on this evaluation, we conclude that you're sick because of X. And in this case, it's that I'm not getting the nutrients that I need. So that is just like doing a hazard analysis. So in this case, the hazard analysis is the doctor's evaluation. The hazard requiring a CCP is the nutrient deficiency. And the CCP, the critical control point, if we consider my life a process flow, will be just every meal. That's where the control is going to happen, right? Because that's where I'm going to have to write down how many servings of food that I'm eating, of fruit and vegetables, right? So we've done the first two principles of HACCP. Conduct a hazard analysis, determine the CCPs. The CCPs are at the meals. Now we need to establish critical limits. So I put here in the yellow box at the bottom the definition of a critical limit. It's a pretty technical definition, a maximum or minimum value to which a biological, chemical, or physical parameter must be controlled at a CCP to prevent, eliminate, or reduce an acceptable level. Okay, so it's a pretty long definition, but in the analogy, it's quite simple. How many servings of fruit and vegetables do I need to eat every day in order to be healthy? Right? And so I looked on the American Heart Association, and it said, based on a 2,000 calorie eating pattern, if I have 4 servings of fruit a day and 5 servings of vegetables a day, then I'll be healthy. Okay, so what's the critical limit? The critical limit is 4 servings of fruit, 5 servings of vegetable. If I eat less than that, what's going to happen? I'm going to get sick, right? Or I won't get better. If I eat that much or more, I'll get healthy again, right? So that's the critical limit. It's that line that separates what's safe from what's unsafe or questionable, right? So that's an important line. So we've done it now. If we look at the article published by Fred and his colleagues, you'll notice that in preparation of kimchi, they put fermentation as a CCP. That's right here. And that's critical. I recommend you read the article, but they mention in the justification for that is that the pH is just going to be so important for the safety of the food that it's critical that at the fermentation step that they check the pH to make sure that it's going below, I think it was 4.6 or whatever the number is going to be to make that safe. Right? So here it is. This is also from the paper. Yeah, they said CCP ferment to pH less than or equal to 4.6. All right, and they have specific instructions on how to do that, and it may vary plant to plant, but that's what you'll need for your critical limit. All right, so the next step is establish monitoring procedures. What is monitoring? Sounds pretty straightforward. It is to conduct a planned sequence of observations or measurements to assess whether a CCP is under control and to produce an accurate record for future use and verification. All right, so if you look at this analogy, what I'd like you to do is type into your chat, which do you think is the monitoring step? Go ahead, type it in the chat, I'm watching. Okay, somebody says a blood test. Somebody says wife has to sign off. Other people say sign off. Okay, more blood tests. Okay, and let's see, the record. Writing down the meals, somebody said. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna stop right there. I'm gonna go back into the analogy. So some people are thinking of this in terms of how we conventionally use use monitoring outside of a food safety context. So in that sense of the word, you're correct. But in the HACCP world, there's a very specific definition, which I just said. And in this case, it's going to apply to the step where I'm writing down all my meals. Because monitoring, if you look at the definition there, is to assess whether a CCP is under control. So it's when I'm writing it down that I'm monitoring that I'm eating 4 servings of fruit and 5 servings of vegetable. That's where I'm documenting that it happened, right? So I'm watching it, I'm monitoring. I'm also, if you look at the second bullet, I'm creating an accurate record for future use and verification, aren't I? Because later, my wife is going to sign off that I actually did it. She's going to be verifying that I did what I was supposed to. Right? So that would be the monitoring step. It's when we're documenting. So if we think in terms of Fred's paper and making kimchi and fermentation as CCP, monitoring would be when you check the pH with the pH meter, and then you write it down. At this hour, the pH was 5.0, right? That's monitoring. We'll get to verification later. All right, so establish corrective action. So let's say that with kimchi, for example, your critical limit is 4.6. You don't get there. It never gets below 4.6. That means you have what we call in HACCP world a deviation. So you need to initiate a corrective action. What are we going to do with your fermented food now that it didn't get to a safe pH? What are we going to do to it? You can put it in the chat. Toss it. Yes, I'm going to go with that first response. Yes, you might toss it. You might, somebody said, well, if it's really early, you might add more acid, maybe. So maybe you can rework it. It's what we say, where you might add more acid, but for many, it might be throw it out. Anyways, whatever the case, HACCP says you need to have a game plan. If when you're monitoring your critical limit, if you don't hit that critical limit, you need a game plan about what you're going to do. And that's what the corrective actions are. And you're expected to predict what could go wrong. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, if your critical limit, if your only CCP is fermentation and you're looking at dropping the pH, you can say, well, what happens if I don't drop the pH? Have a game plan. That's what corrective actions is. So if we go back to the analogy, here's the definition of corrective action. Procedure followed when a failure to meet a critical limit occurs. All right, so let's say that I forgot to write down the number of servings of fruit and vegetables I did in a day. Uh-oh, I forgot. Is that foreseeable? It is. Sometimes there are gaps in our records, so we should have a corrective action prepared for that. What if I don't eat the number of servings I'm supposed to in a day? What can we do? We can't throw me out, right? Well, we might have a corrective action that says, well, then the next meal we're going to eat, more servings of fruit and vegetable, or, I'm going to increase, the number I eat a day, whatever. We'll have a corrective action in place for that. What if we have blood tests or checkups that show that I'm not improving? Well, if the blood tests say I'm not improving, there could be a couple explanations for that. One, it could be that I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. In other words, I'm not implementing my HACCP plan as it's intended to be implemented, right? So I'm skipping on fruits and veggies, I'm doctoring records or something. Or maybe I didn't consider all the hazards in my hazard analysis. Maybe I have a genetic predisposition that says, this isn't going to work for me. Maybe I need to do something else. Maybe I changed my exercise routine. Maybe I don't have a 2,000 calorie diet. So the study that we're citing is not accurate. It needs to be adjusted. So we might need to revisit our hazard analysis and update it. So HACCP is, like I said, systematic. It involves feedback loops where we take data and go back and go, is this plan, sure, we're doing what we say we're doing, but is it effective? Is it doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? All right, so number 6, establish verification procedures. So verification, I have the technical definition on the left, but I'm going to just paraphrase it on the right here. Verification is it has sort of 2 different elements to it. One of them is, are you carrying out the plan as intended? Are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? And then the second part is it valid? Is it actually effective in doing what it's supposed to be doing? So if we look at the analogy, my wife signing off is a verification step because she's verifying that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And the blood tests are a verification step because they're a way of verifying that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. If the blood tests say that I'm not improving and everything is controlled, then maybe I'm not following the regimen the way I'm supposed to, or there are other problems. So that's an important verification step to also say, is this a valid system or a valid control? And the annual checkup is another verification step because she's going to be evaluating me and going, oh, okay, is the plan working or not? Okay. So validation is a very important piece of HACCP. It's important because it says, hey, this plan, the controls, if you do it, it's actually going to work. And this is actually one of the most challenging parts of HACCP because it's not a skill that we all have. That's something, people like Fred have, people who are food scientists, process authorities. They have a greater ability to look at the existing science or conduct challenge studies or whatever to make sure our controls are effective or not. And we can talk about that more in the Q&A. But that's a very important piece because if we have a HACCP plan where the controls don't work, what good is the HACCP plan, right? Because the whole purpose is to make safe food. So the last principle of HACCP is establish record keeping and documentation procedures. So the idea is if it's not written down, it never happened. So when you get an audit or you get an inspection from FDA or USDA, whoever, they're going to go through your records to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. So they're a very, very important piece to what you're doing. They provide assurance that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And they also provide data that you can trend because HACCP is systematic. It involves continuous improvement, and you use that data to make sure that it's always working. So in the case of my analogy, my records are going to be like my daily meal log, my corrective action log, all the medical records that I get, any validation studies that I'm relying on. In the kimchi example that we talked about from Fred's article, it might be a batch sheet where you're recording the pH as it drops over time, right? That would be an important record. Your calibration records for your pH meter, those would be important as well. And there could be a number of other things. Those are the 7 principles of HACCP. I hope that that cleared things up for you a little bit, at least as an introduction. There are a couple more definitions I just want to mention before wrapping up. The HACCP plan is the written document that you have, which includes the hazard analysis tables. It's all in the yellow box here. Your CCP tables and all the logs and procedures that are associated with CCP monitoring, corrective action verification, and all your validation materials. So all those bundled together are your HACCP plan. A lot of people wonder, what does a HACCP plan look like? That's what it is. You can also include the documents for your preliminary HACCP tasks, like your flow diagram, your product description table, team table, stuff like that. The HACCP plan are the written documents. It's what you plan to do. It's your written plan. The HACCP system is what you get when you implement it. So you're going to get all kinds of records that could spin out of it, right? Your calibration records, your batch sheets, all that stuff. And those taken together with your HACCP plan and any reevaluating that you do, it could be in a reanalysis form or whatever, those are all going to be your HACCP system, which is a living, breathing thing. So to review, in a HACCP plan, I'm going to just skip ahead to what's next, because this is actually going to review that, and then I'll stop. So I should try to get this done in just a couple minutes. When we think about what's next, let's go step by step through the 12 steps. We have a team table. Who should receive formal training on HACCP in your team? What's your in-house training program going to look like? Because people are going to have to be trained. If somebody's going to be doing monitoring, they might not be on the HACCP team, but they still need to know what they're doing, what they're looking for, what the corrective actions are going to be. Training's going to be a very important thing. What safeguards do you have in place if you have employee turnover? And how is this not going to disrupt your whole HACCP implementation? Because a lot of times people don't have resources, many human resources, and so they have one person do HACCP and then that person leaves. So if you're especially in the food service retail space, turnover is just the bane in the industry, and that's really going to be disruptive. So you should plan for that. Also, how will you approach financial, cultural, and other practical obstacles to HACCP development and implementation? So I really encourage everybody to have HACCP and food safety and all that in your business plan, because it's going to have expenses associated with it. It requires investment. And if you're not prepared to make those investments, then you're really going to stumble through this process. Also, if you don't have the culture to support it, or the training to support it, or the time that you can allocate to do it, then it's not going to be successful. Sorry, hold on one second. Just make sure this is good. Make sure that door is locked. For your product description tables, that's where you're going to have your specs. So do you have a shelf life validated by a laboratory? Are there any unintended uses by consumers that you need to consider? For your flow diagrams, one of the biggest challenges with this is you can have 10 people in a room and you end up with 10 different flow diagrams. So you really want to make sure that it's complete and that it's accurate. And that's one reason why it's great to do it as a team. And I really recommend drafting a supplement to it where you summarize every single step. Because I can't tell you how many times when I'm with a client, we write down a process narrative to accompany our flow diagram, and they discover all steps that they forgot to mention. When we get to the conduct a hazard analysis in HACCP, you know, how do you know where all the hazards are? How do you know that you're considering the right ones? So to help you with this, you may need to go outside of your organization. A lot of companies, especially small ones, don't have that kind of expertise in-house. So some examples I bulleted down there at the bottom. There's guidance from government. There's scientific literature out there. If you're not proficient in that, you might need to rely on a consultant or a university extension specialist. Universities all around the country, they have extension programs that are a bridge between academics and industry, and they can be enormous help. There are industry groups like the Fermentation Association, but there are many others that provide lots of really great guidance. For example, formerly the GMA, now they're, I think, Consumer Brands Association, publishes really amazing environmental monitoring document about how to control listeria in a food facility. And it's available free for everybody. And there are a lot of different industry groups that can support your food safety programs. Process authorities as well. They can help you engineer controls if there are none that are already in place. Make sure that they're safe. These same support groups can also be helpful for determining your critical limits, determining your CCPs, validating your controls, right? So you really need to think about that and think if you have that expertise in-house or not. As far as drafting your monitoring, corrective action, verification procedures, all your record keeping, really need to think about how are you going to draft all that? How are you going to organize it? How are you going to manage it? What platform are you going to use? It's there's a lot of different documents, and if you don't have a system for organizing those and managing them, then it's going to become a rat's nest real quick. So have a plan for that, and maybe that can be a focus of another webinar. And also consider when you're devising your system, how flexible is your plan going to be to change? If you change your flow, or if you add a new product or a new CCP, sometimes when we develop these things, they can be really inflexible, and it creates huge amounts of work to just make minor tweaks or minor changes. Also consider employee turnover. Your person who oversees your HACCP plan might leave, in which case you're going to just hand over this nasty big binder with nobody can figure out what it means. So you might want to develop your plan in a way that makes that transition easier. And also you want to develop it in a way that it facilitates a smooth, easy inspection by the government or an audit. Right? So it should be easy to show. So that's it. I think I might have gone a little over time, but I hope that was useful. And the Q&A is really important because we have some really good minds here. And if that, with that, I'll just turn it back over to David.
Charlie, if you could do one thing for the group here, could you give a clear definition of validation versus verification?
Sure. Yeah, I kind of skipped over that. Okay. So here's the definition of verification. Those activities other than monitoring that determine the validity of the HACCP plan. So validation is actually a subset of verification. It's a type of verification because we can verify two things. We can verify, are you doing what you say you're doing? Right? And then we can verify, is it actually working? Because if you're doing what you say you're doing, and then it's not, and then you're making unsafe food, whatever it is that you're doing isn't working. Right? So validation is technically defined here. It's a part of verification that's focused on collecting and evaluating scientific and technical information, determine if the HACCP plan, when it's properly implemented, will actually control the hazards.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome. Hope that helped.
I've got a question for you, Charlie. And you sort of addressed this right at the end. You were talking about maintaining a HACCP plan and developing it. If you change, do you have to change your entire HACCP plan if you're making modifications to your product? Or for example, if you're making radish kimchi versus cabbage kimchi, do you need a separate HACCP plan for every different modification or type of product? Can you address that for us?
That's a good question. So if you are making a number of different products, let's say fermented carrots, you're making carrot kimchi, radish kimchi, and cabbage kimchi, and your process flow is identical for all of these, and the controls are virtually identical for all of these, then you could collapse all of them together into a single HACCP plan. That would not be an issue. Once you start having differences in your process or different hazards that require different controls, at that point you might want to consider breaking out a product into a different HACCP plan. As far as making a change to a plan, does that mean that you need to toss the old one? Is that what I understand you're saying? Do you need to toss the old one and then make a whole new one? No, you should be, that's what, well, it depends on how you developed it. So if you developed it in a way where you could easily update it, great. You can just update it and that's it. You might want to keep a record of the old one so that you have some, history of the documents changing, but no, you can make those changes. The difficulty is when you make a change to your flow. Let's say you add a new process step, it has a butterfly effect that ripples through the rest of your plant, because now that you've updated your flow diagram, what else do you need to update? Your process narrative, if you have one that accompanies it. Your hazard analysis, because now you need to add another row for that particular step. And then you'll need to update that. If there's a new critical control point, you would need to update your critical control point table to include another critical control point. Do you need to update your monitoring documents or verification documents to include additional fields to account for that? So that's the way that even if you have a really well-developed HACCP plan, if you make a minor tweak or a minor change, it can have a ripple effect through the plan where it just adds work, but it's not rocket science. You just have to make sure everything is consistent with each other across the board.
Okay. Charlie, one of the things we found is that we have done everything for HACCP at Sonoma Brinery in a very manual manner. And when we do record keeping, it has resulted in, we literally have a whole shelf or stand-up shelf with 4 or 5 layers on it that are full of binders full of records. And this has been very burdensome. There's a lot of software out there that supports this, and we're right now in the final stages of evaluating and choosing a package that we're going to use. Our neighbors, Shavu, who we share a building with, have automated their process. Can you speak a little bit to the role of these software packages and assisting manufacturers with the burdensome paperwork and so on?
Yeah. All this food safety stuff, it just seems so amenable to software because it's so rigid and all that stuff. But there's a considerable price tag that comes with a lot of these solutions. So like if you look at food safety chain is one, many companies, some that I've consulted have opted to hire a software developer to develop their own solution using like Microsoft Access or something like that. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both, right? I mean, if you buy into, let's say something like food safety chain, which is just on the market for everybody. It might be kind of like a one size fits all. It might not be the perfect fit for what you do, but it works. But it's expensive, and it's not like a one-time cost. It's not like when you buy Microsoft Office and you install it on your hard drive, right? I mean, this is a recurring annual fee that could be in the thousands to tens of thousands of dollars. Right? On the other hand, if you hire somebody to develop one for you, you might get bugs. How reliable is that person? And so you're still going to be paying money. Clients that I've had that have done that, they still pay thousands of dollars a year to maintain it and update it and fix bugs and stuff like that. So, but it might be a better fit for them because it's been customized to whatever their needs are. There are other softwares out there that are more tailored to traceability. There's TraceGains, for example, where, really useful for recalls, traceability purposes, stuff like that, but might not have all the modules that you want for HACCP and stuff like that. So what I really recommend doing is these people, they're going to make a ton of money if you buy their product. So what I really recommend is just reaching out to some of those leaders and doing their demos and figuring out which is the best fit for you, because all of them are going to be different in their approach, and figure out which is best fit for you, what's the best price for you. And you may find out that you're not ready for that financially yet, at which point you're going to have to default to the manual system. And I think that doing it on a platform like Microsoft 365 or on SharePoint, I prefer myself to use the Google platform, like Google Business. That's sort of a good middle ground between doing it totally manually and getting a software, but everything has its limitations.
Fred, I have a question for you. So I'm a vendor and I make fermented something or other. I'm concerned about pathogen control. What would you recommend? Where would you recommend I go so that, I can pick the phone up and call Fred, but there's probably 1,000 vendors out there and Fred might be busy and I might get a busy signal when I call Fred. So what would you recommend as I'm going through the steps that Charlie's outlined here? And I want to establish a critical control point. I'm not a microbiologist, but I am a fermenter. And where in your world would I look to find guidance on what my critical control point ought to look like?
Well, that's a pretty tough question to answer, because there's a lot of different types of issues that you could encounter. In terms of the general microbiological hazards, certainly looking to the scientific literature that we've produced we have a website that has all our publications, pardon me, and that's a good place to go. My typical advice when people call me, and by the way, we believe in good customer service, so we do try to answer our phones. But I generally refer people to folks like Charlie, who are much more hands-on to really understand these hazards. You got to go to the plants. You got to look at what people are doing. I can give you advice over the phone about what the science is behind the microbiology, but a guy like Charlie here, who is going to be actively working with the folks in the industry, looking at their process, you really need somebody to be there hands-on with that kind of experience if you want to get a really good answer. So, and what I often tell people is, look for process authorities at universities or, folks like that, and, consultants, and, TFA can refer you to people like Charlie as well. So,
right.
So that's a good source. Yeah. So there's no real one answer to that. I don't know, Charlie, do you have any comments or things to add in?
Yeah, it's really hard to do a remote assessment of a plant, because all the time I ask some preliminary questions before I go out to do an on-site with a client, and I'll get some picture from them of what they do, and I will arrive and it will be completely different. I don't know if you've ever had that, but yeah. It's like, whoa, night and day difference. So yeah, there's no replacement for being on site and actually seeing what they're doing. And part of it is because many people who are, been making food for years, they're good at making delicious food, but they've never used the part of their brain that thinks about it the way that we might from a HACCP perspective. And so it's like a muscle that needs to be practiced, and it takes time. And that's one reason why bringing a consultant in or a university extension specialist can shorten the timeline by, eliminating a lot of mistakes that you might make and stuff like that. But, I agree that, it's important for somebody to be on the ground and see what's going on, because every plant's different.
I wanted to, go ahead, Charlie. Go ahead, David. Okay, well, I wanted to follow up on a point that you made about critical control points. You talked about critical control points, but in a process, you can have many controls, right? Some of which would be possibly critical and others not critical. Could you clearly describe for people the difference between those? Because I think that's an important point.
Sure. Yeah. And you mentioned this in your paper. You make a distinction between critical control points and control points.
Well, I'll say it. It wasn't. You can't call it my paper. Abby Snyder was really the lead author on that. Barb Ingham and Elizabeth Anders. I was mainly doing the science part. I'm not a regulatory person, and those folks really carried the ball mostly on that paper. But go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, I couldn't remember I should say, Fred et al. Or some, but I'll just say the paper or the opus. But I did mention, prerequisite programs, and that a HACCP plan, an effective HACCP plan, rests on a solid foundation of good manufacturing practices, good operating conditions, good environmental conditions for making safe food. And there are steps that are vital to making sure that the HACCP controls, the critical controls, are going to be effective. So I mentioned that, if you don't wash your hands, you could have the best HACCP plan in the world. Those CCPs might not be effective because you're not doing the basic stuff. In the kimchi example that you guys had, it was measuring out the salt that was going to be added to the cabbage or whatever you're going to use to make the kimchi. That's really important that you hit that with like 2% to 2.5% salt to make sure that you are going to get the pH curve that you need. So that's an important supporting step. It's important to have that standardized. So you have a standard operating procedure, you have batch sheet or whatever it is to document that you're doing it and that you're hitting it routinely. But that might not be a critical step, because more critical is that pH dropping, because it's ultimately the pH that is going to control the hazard. And that's why it's a critical control point, because that's essential to control the hazard, whereas the salt is more of a supporting step. And so that would be a control step, the salting step. And actually most of the points in your process are actually going to be some form of a control point, because when you receive stuff, you're controlling the quality of that food. If you're getting dirty produce in, that's going to affect you down the line. You might be refrigerating certain ingredients. That's important for to support your CCP properly. So there's going to be a lot of control points.
So I have one final question, and it might be useful for you to explain to the vendor community that's listening to this. In my experience, I started fooling around with HACCP when FSMA was being considered, and began to familiarize myself with it. But at the time we were small enough, we were exempted from having to have a plan. And also in time, they finally, when they implemented FSMA, they made the requirement that I guess it was this year that we all have to have a HACCP plan. Charlie, in your experience, how long should a vendor out there who today is, let's say, selling couple $100,000 worth of product, but they're growing well and it looks, like they're going to be doing okay in the future, they want to get serious about this. How long, in your experience, does it take an average vendor to go from the moment he says, okay, we're going to do this, to where he's ready for a third-party inspection of his GMPs and HACCP plan?
That's a great question. And, there's no magic number, just because every companies different. They may have, you know, I've had some people come to me and they're like, I have a line of 20 different products and I want to get SQF certified or something like that. That's going to take a lot more, and they're really complicated process flows. That would take obviously a lot more time than somebody who says, all I do is make canned beans, right? So it's going to depend on the complexity of your process and the different things that you're making, how much groundwork you've already done already to make sure that what you're doing is safe. But it can take anywhere between, you know, 3 months to a year, because, and also everybody has a different amount of time that they can allocate every week to doing this plan development. A lot of people are so busy, you know, they go at a snail crawl. But let's say that you had, you know, all the time in the world to work on it. Everybody else is busy making the product and you're in the office spinning on your chair saying, what can I do? In that case, also, let's assume that you're very competent at looking at this stuff and picking it up. I've had plenty of people who just go, you know, this is just like reading Greek to me. I just don't get it. In which case you may need a consultant to help facilitate things a bit more. But if, you know, if it was me in a room with somebody and we were going to do it real speedy, it can be done if you only have, like, let's say 4 different products, reasonably complex. I imagine you could get there in, you know, 3 months, but you know, you're going to have to implement it, and to implement it, you're going to have to train your team and all that. So it's a real considered effort that's going to involve a lot of different parts. So I don't like to say less time, like 3 months, but a better expectation would probably be between 6 months and a year.
Good, thank you. Amelia?
Hello, thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion. I have one last question for Charlie before we wrap up. Well, Charlie, Fred, and Dave, whoever would like to join in on this. So we received quite a few questions from people starting up a fermentation business. They're transferring from home fermenting to now wanting to do a professional company. How do you work with a HACCP plan and with USDA, FDA regulators when you're working in a shared kitchen? What would be your first step?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Good.
I'm a member of the Association of Food and Drug Officials, or AFDO. It's a really great organization if you're really into the food safety side. And so we meet, and I've presented at their annual conference, and this was brought up. And we had a room full of regulators, you know, for restaurants, food service, manufacturing, everything. And when the shared kitchen thing came up, I could hear the entire room start to groan. Right? So, because HACCP is all about nailing down the basic stuff, you know, having controls in place, so that way when you do your CCP or whatever, it's, you know, it's going to be effective. So when you have a shared kitchen, you have people moving in and out. How do you manage allergens? How do you manage cross-contamination? You're going to have all this cross-traffic. How do you, there's so many different things that make it harder to control the safety of your product and give the assurances that people expect, like inspectors and others, that shared kitchens are just a super tough place to implement a HACCP plan. So what you're going to have to do is adjust your expectations for the HACCP plan and design it so that it's achievable, right? Because if you, one of the things about HACCP is if you have, critical limits need to be achievable. If you can't hit your critical limit, that means that your food by definition is adulterated. So if you have a critical limit that you can't measure, or you can't really hit, or you can't really do the basic GMP stuff to support it, then you're in the hole already. It's just not going to work. So for a shared kitchen, what you would need to do is try to control things as much as humanly possible. You know, you could demarcate spaces in the walk-in that are that's only your product. Have signage or something to make sure that the variables that are being introduced by all these other people that are coming in and out of your kitchen are going to be under control. But that's an uphill battle, and it's a tough one. And I think that while you're doing that, you should keep one eye to the future about, when I grow and I get out of here, what is my facility going to look like so that I don't have to jump through all these hoops? Because I actually think that as hard as it is having a shared facility, in a way it's great, because people who just get $200 million to say, okay, let's fire up a facility, they don't have the benefit of learning from all the mistakes that they made and all the challenges that they had in some crappy, awful little space, you know? So that's your period, that's your gestation period for figuring out, wow, like, what do I need? Where does it need to go? And so I think in a way it's extremely valuable, even if it's challenging.
Thank you, Charlie. Dave, how did you manage that when you started? Were you in a shared
Well,
commercial
I
space?
actually did. I started at Sue Borowitz's Trends Catering Kitchen, where I put a barrel in and started making some pickles. Fortunately for me, these were pre-HACCP times, and so I was not burdened at that time with the formality of food safety. I did have a vague idea that there was a relationship between the acid content of a product and its safety. I was aware that botulism has a cutoff point of 4.6. And so putting 2 and 2 together, I sort of divined that it was a good idea to take pH measurements and so on. But I do agree with Charlie that one of the things that's very problematic in a community kitchen is cross-contamination. And there is very little that you can do about cross-contamination other than to put a warning on your label that is some food producers do this. They just put a broad statement. This product was produced in a facility that handles, dairy, nuts, so on and so forth. And that is more of a prophylactic warning that there may not be nuts or dairy or whatever in this kitchen, but to put that on there at least advises people that you are exempting yourself from a very broad area of cross-contamination. The one thing that I think that in modern times, if I had this to do again and in that shared kitchen space, I would educate myself as to, especially take as Charlie did a nice clear discussion of what the steps are that lead into HACCP. I think at minimum, every food vendor should go out and read that. I don't care what stage you're at. Read what Charlie put up there. And then ask yourself the question, how do I know my food is safe? And begin this process of hazard analysis. Also, begin the process of GMP implementation. Simple thing. And, we talk about government regulation being burdensome. I would challenge anybody who's listening to this to go into the GMPs that are defined in CFR 117. Charlie, can't remember the subsection, but you can mention that. Should we not wash our hands? Should we use dirty utensils? Should we work on surfaces that have the potential for cross-contamination? Should we not ventilate the place? Maybe there's, things in there, spores or other things in this place that could be harmful. So should we not ventilate? Or what one GMP should we eliminate? And what you'll find is you can't eliminate any of the GMPs. They're simple, they're easy to follow, they're common sense, they just need to be done. And if you do them, you have a reasonable chance of not contributing to a hazardous environment. And then beyond that, you should take the step to understand what are the things that the product you're making. If you're making a low acid sauce of some sort and you're putting it in a jar, what could happen? And I think every responsible, even if you're in a shared kitchen, to understand what potential biological hazards could exist in that jar. And if you don't know, then tap into the expert community. It's going to be worth a few $100 or $1,000 that you spend to get some advice on what hazards there are and how you might monitor them even as early as you get into this process. And I think that most small companies begin in shared kitchen spaces. It's essential. It's a good place to start the process. And even if you don't have the ability to do the whole thing at that time, you don't have the time or the knowledge or whatever, reading those steps that Charlie outlined and then beginning to think about each one of them, and in particular, beginning to know that you do need to wash your hands before you touch your food. You do need to clean the surfaces. You do need to work with clean equipment. These things, common sense, easy to follow, and easy to begin to think about. And later, when you move into your own facility and have a formal HACCP plan, the foundation that Charlie talks about, these good manufacturing practices that sit at the bottom of all of this, once you've done those, you've eliminated quite a few things that could be problems for you. And then it's on to the things that Fred and Charlie were talking about the control points, measuring, are you going to put in 5% salt? If you do, did you measure that it was 5%? Or did you just say, yeah, it kind of tastes about right? Did you measure it? And it's easy to measure it. There's a $25 tool out there. You can go buy a little spectrometer to tell you what your salt is. Go get that tool and measure it and learn how to do these things, because the modern food manufacturer is not only a food manufacturer, he is a protector, and is entering into a bond of trust with his customers. And that bond of trust says, if you buy what I make, you're not going to die as a result. And while that sounds a little extreme, it is an absolute necessity that we, as food vendors, have this in the forefront of our thinking. No matter how good we think our product is, it has to be safe. And to know that it's safe, those steps that Charlie outlined are simple and easy. The paper that Fred wrote provides a lot of framework around that, and those would be good places for anybody to start. So,
yeah, I would just add, what David mentioned, common sense is an excellent guide to get you started for food safety, but also learn. I would further suggest learn as much as you can about what's going on, the science of the system that you're working with, microbiology, pH, what it is, how you measure it, that kind of stuff. And there's resources out there. The web, you have to be judicious about your sources, but Charlie, maybe you have any final words along those lines?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you totally that common sense, and David, the common sense is very important. But I mean, I remember I went to work, part of my manufacturing experiences from going and working on dairy farms, making cheese and herding animals in France. And I was immediately told when I was there that I lacked common sense. And I did. I was totally out of my element. I didn't grow up on a farm. I didn't know how this worked. And so common sense isn't as intuitive to people when they go into a totally new space. We lack some of those basic, things that allow us to work common sense. So, and this is a controlled study too, because my identical twin brother did the same thing and he was told he didn't have common sense. But we both think that we have common sense when we're back home. So, so I agree that, a journey into understanding this stuff is just as important as when you try to understand, when I ferment things, why does it ferment? What are the things that get you excited about why you get the flavors that you get or the textures that you get? The food safety thing, I think it's really going to help you in the long run if you approach that with the same excitement, because if you don't, it's going to be a lot of work and it'll drag you down. And I see a lot of people get sort of bitter about it. Oh, it's such a drain on my resources, on what I do, but it can help your product get better. It can help you get into new markets. And it is a different language, a different world. So even if you're not going to be get a PhD or any of that stuff, or understand the basic science underlying the mechanisms of how all the things happen, having a strong control of HACCP, food safety, what the expectations are, it's really going to help you. And one of the things that helped me when I first got started was looking at the international standards and see what do they expect of people. So they really write it all down for you, and you can then sort of reverse engineer, or sort of move backward from there about why these are norms and why they're important. And there's a huge amount of resources that are online through different, industry groups and stuff like that, where you can learn about this stuff. So, I mean, I've made this a lifelong, I'm a lifelong student of this, and I think you guys will be too. But you got to start somewhere, and I think that, like David said, the GMPs are a great place to start. And just having access to people like David and Fred, It's just really great through the Fermentation Association. So I think Fermentation Association, I actually tell people, one of the first things I say to do, and I'll stop here, but is join a trade group, because you can learn so much more and get so much further when you pool resources than if you try to go about it by yourself. So I'd like to see more of this from the Fermentation Association, and I think that we're all going along.
If you can indulge me just one sec, I want to punctuate Fred's point here. I started what I thought, I wanted to make pickles, and there was a particular pickle I wanted to make, a barrel fermented kosher pickle. And that's what I thought I was doing in about the first 5 years. And I went through failure modes and different weird things were happening. I had yeast outbreaks, all kinds of different things. And there was a point of inflection in my company's trajectory that maps exactly onto what Fred said. I realized partway through, about, I guess, the 4 or 5 year point, that while I think I'm a pickle maker, what I really am is a bacteria farmer. And while that means I don't have maybe the knowledge, the depth of knowledge, or I certainly don't have the depth of knowledge that people like Fred or Dr. Marco or your wife, Charlie, Rachel, have as professional microbiologists. Nonetheless, as a bacteria farmer, you go out and ask a farmer how he grows corn, and that farmer is going to tell you, if he's a successful farmer, he is going to tell you things that truly are scientifically based, experientially based, so on and so forth. But the point is, without the knowledge of the microbiology that Fred's talking about, I'd have to say to anybody who asks me about this, based on now 16 years, actually 16 years this week of experience in fermenting, don't even think about going into this business if you don't think you're interested in why this is all happening, how it's happening, how you can do it better, how you can influence it, how you can get your acid to drop faster, how you can improve your safety, flavor, all these other things through various techniques. So I couldn't agree with Fred more on this point of you have an obligation to understand this process in greater depth than to just say, wow, man, it's magic. I put the salt in and like it turns into sauerkraut. No. Listen to Fred. He knows what he's talking about. So Amelia, I turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Charlie, Fred, Dave. We really appreciate you guys joining us today. We did not get to everyone's questions. I am going to I will put in the chat box Charlie's website. I know he's available through foodsafetyguides.com. Him and his brother run that business. And Dr. Breidt, I know, is also willing to answer questions. I will put his email in here. Wanted to thank all of you for attending today. We'll post a recording on TFA's website in the next 24 hours. We also have a number of great webinars coming up in the next few weeks, including the new taxonomy of lactobacillus with Michael Ganzel and the state of the art of cider making with Kirsten and Christopher Shockey. Please go to fermentationassociation.org to check these out and to register. And while you're there, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Again, thank you all for joining us today. We so appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.